Greetings. I'm Martha Zavala, President of the League of Women Voters, Pasadena area. Welcome to Thursday with the League. Is the largest sheriff's department in the country accountable to the public? Thank you for joining us. Our topic today is very timely because the sheriff's department actions have garnered a great deal of media attention recently. With an election looming, it's important that our members and other guests recognize that our program today is consistent with the League of Women Voters positions related to good governance, including transparency and accountability. Our organization is committed to encouraging the informed and active participation of residents in government. We neither support nor oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. However, we always work on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. We work hard to make sure voters cast an informed vote. Today's program is being sponsored by our Policing Practices Subcommittee of Social Justice. They invited Max Huntsman, Inspector General of Los Angeles County, as our speaker for today, and he has graciously made time for our program today. Now, I will provide a brief summary of the program for this morning. After IG Huntsman's presentation, we will spend 25 minutes taking questions from attendees. That's you. Please contribute to our event by asking questions. You can enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen. I will present the questions to IG Huntsman, and be aware that your questions may be edited for brevity and to avoid duplicates. We may not have time to include all the questions, and if we don't get to yours, please send it separately by email to events@lwv-pa.org, and we'll try to get you an answer. We will have that screen up for you at the end of the presentation, so you don't have to memorize it. Do not enter your question or any comments in the chat box, as this feature is being used by the webinar staff to keep things running smoothly behind the scenes. If you have any concerns about sound or anything else, you can type them into the Q&A and someone will try to help you. After the Q&A, we'll offer you an opportunity to take action to advance the cause of police oversight, accountability, and transparency. Then I will announce some upcoming events of interest and close the webinar. We are grateful to Pasadena Media. They are recording this event and we will post it to our YouTube channel in a few days for viewing. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Chris Ockershauser, Chair of our Police Practices Subcommittee. She will introduce our speaker. Chris, please welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Glad you're with us for a stimulating conversation about our county sheriff's department, largest in the nation, and whether it is or can be accountable to county government leaders, official oversight bodies, and to us, the general public. Our guest today is Los Angeles County's Inspector General, Max Huntsman, whose charge is to enforce accountability and transparency of the sheriff's department. Mr. Huntsman comes from a strong background of public service with the LA County District Attorney's Office, where his investigations and prosecutions included corruption scandals in the city of Los Angeles and police misconduct in Inglewood. He was appointed the county's first Inspector General in 2013 by the County Board of Supervisors following the scandals of corruptions in the county's jails. Please note we welcome your questions via the Q&A. Now, without further ado, Inspector Huntsman.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about oversight in the County of Los Angeles, a subject that is a little wonky and not always well known to the general public, although I don't think this is the general public. You're obviously people who are interested in what's going on, so that's a good thing. So thank you for being interested. To start with, I want to tell you a little bit about the history and the way it's set up. As Chris mentioned, the question regarding a sheriff's department and accountability is multiple levels. And one of them is accountability to an oversight body, such as Inspector General, accountability to the county leaders who you've elected, in this case, the Board of Supervisors of the Sheriff's Department, and ultimately accountability to the public. So those different layers have different nuances, and that's important because in American government, checks and balances are the way we avoid corruption. And at all levels, you see checks and balances that cause government of different parts of government to have some influence over each other. And that way you have no one part of government that operates unchecked. And that's a very, very important principle. And the way we implement that in policing is also multi-layered. There's, of course, traditional ways, such as the police taking a case to a prosecutor and the prosecutor deciding whether or not to file the case. But of course, as we all know, police with badges and guns can kill people if the circumstances warrant it. And so they need to have stronger protections on them. And so this county created an Inspector General's office some years ago in response to a scandal in which the sheriff and the undersheriff went to federal prison as a result of efforts to obstruct justice. They attempted to intimidate an FBI agent who was investigating misconduct in the sheriff's department. And as you all know from recent headlines, we're facing the same problems today, not involving the FBI, but rather involving my office, members of the press, and other oversight officials. So our office was created to address the chance that we might have another problem like we had years ago, and here we are with another such problem. We were created initially by ordinance in the county. So we exist as a body of the Board of Supervisors. I have a staff of close to 30 people now who do different kinds of oversight, and we do review of the jails in order to monitor conditions, because sheriffs take care of that. But we also look at matters that result in action on the street, patrol, because the sheriff's department is like LAPD, is a police agency out on the street. And so we monitor that as well. We look at the discipline system and we write reports. In a moment, I'm going to show you our website so you can look at it at your leisure. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's available to you, and I'll show it to you so you can see where you can learn more about the things I'm talking about. So we were created for that purpose. And initially we were created by ordinance, but as you all know, after George Floyd was killed, generally the public throughout America rose up and said, we need to have some changes in the way that we oversee police conduct and ask for such things. So a number of laws were passed in California. And if you followed that, you saw that many laws didn't get passed that people were asking for, but some did. And an important set of them related to inspectors general at a county level. And I think they were passed in part because of conduct that was occurring at the sheriff's department in Los Angeles, although also up in Sacramento. And they gave us authority to issue subpoenas. They gave the Civilian Oversight Commission, which we work with, and I'll talk about that more later, I think, in response to some of the questions. So we got a lot more ability to get information, but the Sheriff's Department has not complied with those laws. So what I'm talking about is the legal framework, not the actuality. The actuality of oversight in Los Angeles County is that there isn't any, because the Sheriff's Department refuses to comply with those laws, refuses to provide information that they're required to my office. And there's a series of legal challenges ongoing. And with that, I'll go to my website because that's one of the things it addresses. I'm going to try to share my screen here. We'll see how well I do. Okay, so here's the website. And to get there, you go to oig.lacounty.gov on your web browser. And we put that in the chat. So, but OIG is short for Office of Inspector General. And if you type that in and type LA County, the web will take you here. As you can see on the website, there's a bar at the top, and you can go to publications if you'd like, and that will give you organized by a department, because we also monitor the probation department. Here's the sheriff's department. You click on that, and you can see all the reports we've issued over the years, arranged by year. And if you just go to 2022, at the top of the list, you'll see our most recent reports. One is about body cameras. It's something we monitor the implementation of on an ongoing basis. We recommended body cameras years ago, and there was recently a filing on a deputy who punched a woman and lied about it in a report. That filing, and this is just like 2 days ago that was reported, that filing was made possible because of body cameras. if there wasn't a body camera, the report, which was false, would have not resulted in a filing, because it would have been one person's word versus another, and the body camera allowed that prosecution to go forward. And then the second one there is about a deputy-involved shooting that happened some years ago. A gentleman named Twyman was shot by a deputy who, a couple of deputies approached a car. The car moved, the driver moved it, and they moved out of the way and shot in order to protect themselves, which may violate policy, but they had a reason to do it. But then one of the deputies, after the car had moved away and stopped, appears on video to have gone and gotten an assault rifle and fired into this vehicle, which appeared to have unarmed people in it. It was motionless, and therefore there's a criminal prosecution result. That report there is about the internal process, and the sheriff's department chose to fire that person without conducting an administrative investigation. And this report discusses why that was a bad idea. Not that the firing of a person who does what I just described is a bad idea, but that there's an appropriate process to make sure it works well and professionally. And that was not followed. Now, to go back up to the home section, you can see also we have these radio buttons on different issues. And as you'll see, there's deputy gangs and unlawful conduct of the sheriff's department. I'm not going to go through those now, but if you click on the learn more buttons on either of them, you'll get to another page where you can see information about both those subjects. We've reported on some of the conduct. You will see, though, that the unlawful conduct is not up to date, because as you've read in the papers recently, some crazy things have happened of late, and they're not on our website just yet. They will be later. We'll catch up when we can, but always it takes a little while. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And now if I can get out of this, oh, here we go. Stop share. There we go. That gives you an example. I think if you go to that website, you'll see reports. And if you open them up, you'll see very detailed descriptions of what happens in the sheriff's department. An example being when the sheriff was first elected, he decided to hire a political crony of his who was a member of a deputy gang. The Grim Reapers had a tattoo and had used that status to intimidate his girlfriend, who was also a deputy sheriff, and had been fired for it. And the sheriff decided to rehire him because he liked him. And that was unlawful. It was prohibited by law because he had been lawfully fired through the civil service process, and the sheriff didn't have the authority to do it. He was advised of that, and he went forward anyway. We wrote a report on that. That's where all my troubles with the sheriff began. For those of you who are familiar with them, I won't bore you with all of them, but I'm public enemy number 37. I've been under criminal investigation for years now. Recently, we saw a Times reporter being targeted. She was targeted for allegedly conspiring with me, the grand criminal behind all these things. So that's the state of oversight in LA County, which is that the sheriff's department targets the investigators in the same way they did before I was hired. Did against the FBI when the FBI was investigating them. Although we investigate them by law in order to make sure that the sheriff's department is following the law, they have turned around and tried to throw me in jail for doing my job. That's the world we live in. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but the answer is that the sheriff's department is not accountable. That's the short answer. And with that, I will turn things back over to President Zavala and possibly answer some questions.
Thank you very much. I think that you hit the nail on the head. What our audience is interested in is finding out what mechanisms are available to try to keep, the sheriff accountable to the people who elected him, the people that his department polices. And I want to thank you for taking on this job, this work, and continuing, even though sometimes I think, you may feel you're working uphill, but I think somebody has to do it. So one of our first questions is, why has LASD, the LA County Sheriff's Department, been unable to end the presence of these deputy gangs for over 50 years? Various citizens commissions calling for an end to the department, corruption in the department, as you stated about the former sheriff and under sheriff.
I think there's different answers to that question over the years. I think there have been times when the sheriff's department has made some effort to try to do something about it, and times where they haven't. The current sheriff is aggressively protecting the deputy gangs I gave you an example of a rehiring of the deputy gang. There was a cover-up, which you can read about on the website if you want, and, an incident which the gang, the banditos, beat down some fellow deputies. And I use the term gang here. There's a code section in the penal code that defines law enforcement gangs, and it defines them to include groups that discriminate against other deputies in their membership and say, well, only Hispanics can join, or only African Americans, or only whites. The Vikings were famously declared to be a deputy gang by a federal judge in the 90s for their white supremacy. And that group, the undersheriff ended up being one of them many years later. This Banditos case, the Banditos beat down some other deputies. So before we ever get around to what happens to the public, the deputies themselves get influenced by these gangs, as we see with all gangs. They're more about social control first, and then victimizing others. And the sheriff's department conducted an investigation in which they suppressed gang evidence in order to present an unfileable case to the DA's office, and that's detailed in a description there. So currently, we're under a situation where the sheriff's department protects the gangs. But there have been times over the years where there has been, I think, some effort to try to do something about it. Our current sheriff did indeed create a policy that on its face says it will get rid of gangs. He's never enforced it, and it's more of a political ploy, I think. But I do think there's a desire on the part of the sheriff, the management, to get rid of them because they're not good for business. But also the county itself would like to get rid of them. County council, the board of supervisors, myself would like them to be gone, and yet we're unable to do so over 50 years. And I think that's because they are so deeply embedded into the structure of the sheriff's department. They've been there so long that they're dug in like the roots of a tree, and are protected through a desire for secrecy. They thrive upon secrecy, and the sheriff's department has always kept confidential and secret who's in what gang. So we know about Mandoyan being in a gang because his matter was placed in the public sphere by the sheriff's department and by litigation and by his conduct. But most deputies, we don't know whether or not they're the member of one of these gangs. And it's that secrecy, first, that allows them to continue to exist, and secondly, causes them to do incredible damage before you even get to them punching somebody. They will lie in order to protect their fellow members, because it's part of the code is that you can't rat out your fellow members. And so while everybody knows who's a member, they don't know under oath. So when you ask somebody under oath, who's a member, they refuse to tell you, and that's a rule. so that's one of the main reasons.
Yeah, I imagine that there's some protection that's extended to them by Fourth Amendment rights.
First Amendment, yes, that's correct. The sheriff's department makes a big deal out of that, and of course we all have a First Amendment. You can't ask me my political opinions, or you can ask me, but you can't you can't make my employment depend on that. But we're not talking about First Amendment rights. We're not talking about the right of a deputy to say, I like this or I like that. We're talking about gang activity. Gang activity is not protected by the First Amendment, never has been in the public, and it's certainly not in law enforcement circles.
And I would imagine protection of Fourth Amendment being searched, looking for tattoos.
Yeah, right. You have to have a reason to conduct a search. That's correct. And then the Fourth Amendment also has other procedural protections, and peace officers have extensive procedural protections. But they're not. The only rule there is reasonableness. So I can't search you for a tattoo now because I think you could possibly be in a gang. But if you are a peace officer and you're being investigated for conduct involving punching other peace officers, and there's word that you did that because you were a member of a gang, oh yes, I can search you, and right. I can ask you questions about that. And that's exactly what the sheriff's department didn't do in all those investigations, and hasn't done for years. The gangs continue to exist because they're protected by a code of silence by the management of the sheriff's department, and have been for 50 years. It's varied in the way and it's happened. Sometimes it's been benign neglect, and sometimes it's been very aggressive, as we're seeing today, but it's always been there.
So, it seems that the LAPD chief, who is appointed and can be fired by the LA Police Commission, is much more accountable to city government and the public than LASD. Do you think that appointing a sheriff would make LASD more accountable than having an elected sheriff?
I do. I personally, and this is my opinion, not the official opinion of the county or anybody else, but personally, based on my experience, I think that's absolutely the case. It's not to say that it's a perfect system. There is no governmental system of checks and balances that will magically make everything work the way you want forever. Inspector generals included. I mean, we're a current response to police misconduct that someday will become useless because we'll be part of the system and just won't function anymore, is my prediction. But appointing, I do think, is a better approach, primarily because when you want somebody to run a law enforcement agency, it's like a doctor. You want an expert. You want a person who's very good at their job, is professional and does it well. And then you also want them to respond to you. The being responsive part can be controlled by law, usually, although currently we're seeing the sheriff's department just ignore laws, and that's a problem. Yes, that's not currently happening at LAPD, but it has happened in the past. But the responsive part, yeah, absolutely. If you're appointed by a political body, then you're going to respond to them and you're going to listen to them. And that's how the public influences the high level decisions. So if you look at LAPD, not perfect at all, but you do see the chief is a cop. He thinks like a cop, but he also responds to the civilian authorities and their concerns and doesn't refuse to honor subpoenas or place them under criminal investigation. And so you blunt some of that nastiness that can develop in law enforcement if it's unchecked. So I think that's very important, and I think it's a good idea. And secondarily, I think the professionalism is important. In the sheriff's department, we have a problem with professionalism because of the way it's structured historically, and so it's very important that it be professional. But it's not a panacea, and everybody has to make up their own mind about what they want, because we all know in politics, right? Politics is a dirty word. Democracy is a great word, but politics is horrible because the public always votes for representatives to do things for them, and sometimes they get told a story that turns not to be true. So it's hard for the public's will to make its way into the actual actions we see on the street. And that's why some people would say, oh, no, you need to have the sheriff be elected because you don't want the politicians interfering politically. And there's some truth to that, but I do think that our laws are written in a way to allow myself, for instance. I was politically appointed years ago, but I don't get interfered with because what I do is based upon laws, and my job is to enforce certain laws and to do them in a particular way, just like the district attorney's office or the sheriff's department or the LAPD. We function off of laws. We're law enforcement. And so we have a built-in sort of professionalism that insulates us a bit from political influence. It's not that simple, and it's a fight you got to fight every day. But I think that's a better fight to be fighting than to have an actual politician running a law enforcement agency. To give a politician whose whole job is to tell a pretty story to the public to get elected, and that's what politicians do. God love them. We created them, so we can't complain too much. But to give that kind of person direct authority over criminal investigations of people. Now, maybe I'm biased being under criminal investigation by such a politician, but seems like a mistake to me. It seems like there ought to be some checks and balances.
Speaking of that, usually there are consequences to ordinary people who willfully ignore legal subpoenas. What kind of recourse is there in this continued willful ignoring of legal subpoenas?
Well, yeah, there's two answers to that question. One is there's a system whereby law enforcement is supposed to be under greater checks and balances than your average person, right? It's one thing if you or I jaywalk. It's another thing if a police officer does, because they are the law, they are armed. And so they really are supposed to be under a series of checks to control their behavior. And that's part of this elected versus appointed problem. Our sheriff is not being effectively overseen by the Attorney General's office, not being effectively investigated by the district attorney's office, who are bodies that are really supposed to deal with these problems directly. But we've had deputy gangs for 50 years, and those bodies haven't done anything about it. I don't say that they don't want to, they just haven't. So clearly, there are people who are above the law, and the sheriff is above the law in that sense. Now, the way the sheriff is not above the law is that we still have a court system. So with respect to the subpoenas, in each case where the sheriff has defied the subpoenas or in which he's sought unlawful court orders, you can look on the website if you want to look into some of these details under unlawful conduct of the sheriff's department. We've gone to court. And we've gotten a court order directing him to follow the law. We've done that maybe a half dozen or so times now. And in each case, then the sheriff will grudgingly do a little bit more. So in one sense, the law is working. He's being held accountable, but he's being held accountable. He's committing misconduct at a Mach 1 pace, incredibly fast, over and over. And the judicial system, which is not designed for law enforcement to go rogue, is very slowly correcting each of those mistakes. And so 10 years from now, they'll all be corrected, but we'll have gone through several cycles by then.
So, I understood that there is a process for removing unelected officials, certain elected officials from office for failure to really perform their duties.
Yeah, there's multiple provisions. The one I think that you're thinking of is a government code provision, 3060 of the government code, which permits the district attorney or the attorney general to bring up a grand jury that would then indict a public official for not doing their job or for doing their job unlawfully. As I say, I think on my website, you'll see a substantial amount of evidence of that here. Problem is, and this is why I get back to that question of elected versus appointed, none of these are magical solutions to anything. The public has to be involved because the people who have to do that, they run for election too. The DA is facing a recall attempt that is being run by the sheriff, amongst other people, in order to suppress the DA's liberal policies, but also to suppress the DA from being able to take action against the sheriff. So is he going to fire up a grand jury and try to remove him? The Board of Supervisors has from time to time pushed back against the sheriff over their limited oversight that they have. I mean, in theory, they can do quite a bit. They can defund the police if they want, but they don't want to do that. We need the police. What we want is for the police to follow the law. So the board has only the option of cutting budgets, and they can't really do anything beyond that. And that's a very hard situation to put them in. And so they're hesitant to do anything to be seen as that's anti-democratic. It's very hard for them to try to control that sheriff. The attorney general, same thing. He got appointed and he's going to be up for election. So does he want to bring about a 3060 action that will be portrayed as anti-democratic? There's always a political element to these decisions on the part of other elected officials. That's why checks and balances are so important. You need to have multiple provisions. And so we have, the old classic we all learned about in civics, the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. So you have the executive branch or folks who enforce the law and have free reign to do certain things, limited things, such as police or myself, law enforcement. The legislature then gets to make the laws and the courts rule on them. So there's a process, but it's not being used for reasons that are beyond me. And there's also discussion, as I think we'll get to in a moment, about a potential amendment to our charter to make a more direct process. Although I think you can guess that from what I'm saying, that's not a magic solution either. I'm in favor of it, but it's not going to magically make these problems go away.
Right. It's my understanding that a quick way to get that charter change would actually be for the board perhaps to put something on the ballot for November, kind of control mechanism.
Quick in the sense that I think the board can just make a motion and do it. But does that help anything? Does it get passed? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whether or not you like democracy, we have to get support. People have to galvanize behind doing something. And if the board just out of fiat puts something on the ballot, then it gets voted on. That's what happens. Whether or not it passes, that's another story. Like subpoenas for the Civilian Oversight Commission, that passed in LA County 70%. Because it went on the ballot at a time when everybody was very focused on the issue, and we were also interested in national politics, and there was a lot of mobilization of voters. And so we got a broad section of people who said, yeah, we think oversight should have subpoena power. But if you did that a different year, an off presidential election, or if there's nobody putting any money in to try to publicize the issue, then the same question could fail. So I think although that's a good shortcut to get on the ballot, does the public get informed? How many people are on the webinar right now? 52. So that's not enough votes to carry a charter amendment. You need a large amount of the public to be informed and to decide they care. And that's the nuance. So could the board put it on the ballot? Sure, they could. They can't make it pass, though, just by waving their hands. And nor should they be able to. So really, if the public wants that, the public's got to do grassroots supports for it. There's got to be, sadly, in this day and age, if you've got somebody with some money who kicks some money in and buys TV spots, that's the way democracy works today. It's not pretty, it's not the best option, but we live in a capitalist country, and so we're stuck with money being the ultimate coin of communication, and that's the world we live in. So that's the reality of it, and I think the board knows that, as does everybody. But could they put it on the ballot? Sure, they could. And could some other bodies get together and support it? Yeah, they could. And could it pass? Yes. Would it be an improvement? Absolutely. Would it magically make the sheriff behave? I don't think so.
So I believe the state constitution calls for a sheriff needs to be elected, including charter counties, and specifically charter counties. So if there was something, presumably, if the board said we can remove a sheriff, that the replacement at this point would have to be elected.
Yes and no. The Constitution says that that's an elected position. So when we talk about appointing sheriffs, that would have to be a constitutional amendment if you decided you didn't want to do that. That provision was put in place, obviously, a long time ago when sheriffs they kept the jails and they also patrolled empty areas. That's why we think sheriff, we think of a cowboy, because they weren't an urban police force. So it's changed a lot now. If you put in that provision, because the Constitution also says you're supposed to have a provision for removing the sheriff. So like San Diego has the provision we're talking about, we don't have it. I think by the Constitution, we're required to have it, but we don't. If you put that in place and the board voted 4 votes, I think you'd need to vote the sheriffs out, which is harder than you'd think, because again, it's a big move. It's the nuclear option. If they did that, they would appoint a replacement. And then that person would sit for election the next time it came up. So yeah, they would be elected eventually. For a while, at least, they'd be appointed. And from time to time, the board appoints positions in the same way that the governor appointed the attorney general. Right. There was a vacancy, but they ultimately have to sit for election because it's an elected position. Judges the same way, right? The governor often appoints judges, but he appoints them into spots which then have to sit for election.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's see, we have some more questions here, and the printing is tiny, so forgive me. It says, can the sheriff's system of governance and public control reform succeed without active participation of the LA Board of Supervisors?
Well, I don't know. I don't think so. I think it needs active participation by the board. It needs active participation by the public. We haven't talked about it yet, but we have this thing called the Civilian Oversight Commission, which was created by the board for just that reason, which is you can't do this without active participation, and the board has to govern the entire county. So they can't spend all their time worrying about the sheriff, because they have to worry about other things like homelessness and healthcare and a lot of other things. And on top of that, for the reasons we just discussed, politically, what 5 people want is interesting and important because they were elected by us, but not the end of everything. Anytime the board takes an action, they've got to check back with the public. That's representative democracy. So they're actively involved. They pass motions all the time. I got to tell you, it's not fun being the subject of a criminal investigation, but boy, did my credibility go up when it happened, because everybody sees what the sheriff is doing, his attempts to intimidate me, other elected officials, and it gets you support that you would otherwise never have. So the board has been very supportive, has passed motions whenever they can to strengthen oversight, has done a lot of things. County council has supported me greatly through all these legal actions we have to take. So is there active effort on the part of the county to correct these problems? Absolutely. But it still takes public involvement. The activists who come to our civilian oversight, folks like you, who are interested in learning and then sharing your opinion, this is what's really essential. Elected officials don't ever work in a vacuum, or if they do, they don't stay elected for very long. Our sheriff, he's tacked hard to the right, and he's trying to get support from deputy gang-like groups, groups that are even militia groups that are very, very conservative in their viewpoint. That's because he needs support. He's not acting in a vacuum. He has to get a group of people to support him. That's why he runs the TV ads he does. That's why he does the sort of political announcements of who he's investigating, when law enforcement usually investigates in secret. So these are all political actions. There's good news and bad news. I mean, it's bad news for me that he likes to investigate me, but it's good news for the public that he's asking them for their support. So the public needs to tell him how they want him to run, and the public needs to tell the board what they will support, and then they will find their elected leaders leading. I know that's not satisfying. We want to appoint somebody and elect them and then have them solve our problems for us. But I'm afraid the bad news is, in America, that's not how democracy works. If you don't stay involved, you get the government you deserve.
Exactly, which is one of the things we're always trying to impress upon people, because I think the issue of electing someone and then trying to get them out because you don't agree with their policies is very different from electing someone and then seeing that perhaps they are not law-abiding and they are not, especially if they're in a position to enforce the law, and then to have them disregard certain features is what the issue is. So I think the protections are there that say you don't get somebody out just because maybe they're not following the policies that you would like. There's your next opportunity at the next election, versus you're not doing your job.
I think that's right. And also, are you responsive, right? So if you have an elected official and they engage in conduct you don't like, and you tell them, and they then change their conduct, well, that's democracy working. I mean, you can elect them or not elect them in the next one, but that's a good thing. So if they do something you don't like, but they respond, I would say you're doing pretty good. Feel free to vote them out, but that's what we want. So in the case of the sheriff, when he started doing crazy stuff, so the Civilian Oversight Commission pointed it out to him. He refused to change, and they eventually said, well, we think you should resign. He didn't take their advice, not surprisingly. But we're talking about a situation where an elected official has really had the law placed in front of them, had it carefully read. Everybody knows what it says. We recently saw that with the sheriff targeting a Times reporter and saying he was going to investigate her for reporting on a cover-up scandal that he was alleged to have done. But he said, well, nobody should have told you about my cover-up, and you shouldn't have reported it. He was immediately told, hey, the First Amendment prevents that. And he backed down. As to the reporter, he didn't back down as to me. So on the one hand, that's democracy working. On the other hand, from my point of view, it's not quite as satisfying as it could be.
I think you might have covered this, but they want to know, have you talk about what is a constitutional sheriff?
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's a fascinating subject. Constitutional sheriffs, it's a movement in America, of a very hard right movement regarding the way we get back to following the law. So, there's always a balance between decisions made by people and laws. And the constitutional concept is, well, the law, the hard written law, is what we should follow, and we should ignore the talk of people who are wrong. And that's in and of itself, I agree with the concept. It's how you implement it. So the constitutional sheriff's implementation of it is, they say, well, look, the Supreme Court, all the courts, all the elected officials, all of them, they're just gone astray, and they don't understand what the Constitution means. Only sheriffs do, and sheriffs have the guns to enforce it, and they must follow the Constitution and ignore everybody else. So Sheriff Joe Arpaio got a lot of press down in Arizona, where he just completely ignored federal court's orders as the sheriff. And eventually he got prosecuted for that. So that's an example of a constitutional sheriff. They actually have an organization, but it's kind of a trend among sheriffs. And our sheriff, I don't know that he's a member of that organization, but he has definitely adopted the concept that he is above the law and that he can act as he wants. And the various people who are saying otherwise are doing so for political reasons. And he is, the embodiment of law. That's the concept of the constitutional sheriff, is that the sheriff, it's like an old John Wayne movie. You give John Wayne the gun, and he goes and takes care of doing what's right. And anybody who doesn't do what's right gets shot, and the good guys win in the end. That's the idea.
Right. Well, since moving to LA City, this particular person is asking, it's been very unnerving to see such a rogue sheriff's department. And are there other cities who have faced this issue? If so, how or what may help to resolve this? I just want to add something. I think it's better than 40 of the 88 cities in LA County who contract with the sheriff right now. What role can those cities play in encouraging compliance? Because they've paid for this sheriff to come into their city.
Yeah, that's good. I'll answer your question first and then go back to the other one, because the other ones I don't really have a good answer for, a short answer to it. But yours, the contract cities, in a way, in theory, like the Board of Supervisors, ought to be able to tell the sheriff what to do, because they should be able to cancel the contract if he behaves unlawfully, which he has. Recently in Compton, there was an allegation of fraud in his contract with Compton, and my office, as required by law, began an audit of the process, and the sheriff's department refused to allow us access to the records, moved them to where we couldn't get them, and refused to even give us copies of what he copied. And so we were not able to conduct an audit to see if the fraud allegations were accurate. So that's unlawful. And you would think that the contract cities would turn around and fire the sheriff. They can't. It's a monopoly. There's only one sheriff, and each of these cities is too small to run their own police force. Compton, great example. They have to run their own police force, and it didn't work out because it's very hard for a small entity to handle the overhead that it takes to run a professional police department. So usually only the big cities like Pasadena or Long Beach or Los Angeles run their own police departments, and some of the smaller cities figure out how to do it, but it's harder for them. So most of the cities contract with the sheriff. They don't have another option. They can't say to their public, they're elected officials, they can't say, guys, we're annoyed that the sheriff isn't following the law, so we're going to take law enforcement off the streets. Nobody wants to hear that. We want to be safe when we walk down the street. I don't like the sheriff breaking the law, but I don't like, criminals breaking the law either. And the sheriff, at least, he's a constitutional sheriff, right? There's some laws that he's going to enforce, and he might be a thug, but he's a thug on the side of law and order. So that's a very hard sell to the public to say we're just going to pull the plug on it because he's breaking the law. And that's the situation they're faced with, which gets us on to the question from the person who asked, how do you solve this problem? I don't have a quick solution other than the ballot box is a great one. So, please send a message appropriately in the ballot box. But between voting, ultimately, I believe our office will be empowered through the courts to function more effectively. When we began, the sheriff stiff-armed us on everything and simply said that he was giving us access to documents when he wasn't. And then we got subpoena power and we went to court, and we've now gotten him to sit down. Last week, he sat down and answered questions under oath. He didn't answer all of them. He made a big fuss, and we're going to have to go back to court about it, but he answered some. So that's a big move in the right direction. So I can't tell you that help is coming soon, but I can tell you help is coming. Your kids might have oversight over law enforcement.
They will face other problems.
There's always other problems.
There's always something, because our favorite term is, democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to be in that game, and you stay in, because you cannot turn away. People with power want to use it, and they'll do whatever they can to stay in power.
That's absolutely true.
We recognize that, and that's why we try to encourage participation, because in fact, it is our job to govern. We cannot leave it to them. We give them a job to do, and it's up to us to make sure that that's what they do. There's a question here, and I happen to already know the answer. I just wanted to bring up something about a possible solution. The city of Santa Fe Springs years ago stopped contracting with the sheriff and went with Whittier PD. So there are options for contiguous cities that have jurisdictions right next to them if the other cities want to.
Absolutely. It's like you say, it's a participatory process and you can come up with solutions, but sometimes they go poorly. I will say, when I was a corruption prosecutor, I handled the city of Bell. And the city of Bell, where for those who aren't familiar with it, the folks in charge started sucking all the money out. It's a very poor community, but they were paying themselves massive salaries and stealing hand over fist. It was crazy. They were in the process of creating a joint policing agreement where a set of local places would have their own police force. They weren't doing that out of the goodness of their hearts. They were doing that to put money in their pockets. I'm not saying Santa Fe Springs was like that at all. I'm just saying, yes, it's hard. There's hard. No paradise out there where everything just works great. You gotta work with the people. That's why I say, if you can get a public official who did wrong but is willing to change their mind and start to behave right, that's the best you might ever get. I'm not saying you shouldn't throw them out when you get the chance, because there needs to be a lesson. I wish we cared more about corruption, but you got to work with what you got, do the best you can, and get them to improve is sometimes the best you can hope for.
Right. There's a question here about separating the coroner's office from the sheriff's department, but I believe LA County is separate.
Yeah, that's correct. It is in some places they're combined. Here they're separate. We're a big enough county that there's no reason to put them together. And that is a good idea. And it is something that people look at as a way to have a check and balance on the sheriff, because coroners, we recently had an inquest done by our coroner regarding a police shooting in which a guy was shot in the back. And the investigators from the sheriff's department took the Fifth Amendment. They refused to answer questions on the grounds that it might incriminate them. They weren't there when the shooting occurred, but they still took the Fifth. Crazy. That was right before the Attorney General began a civil rights investigation of the Sheriff's Department. Oh. If I was a betting man, I'd say the two were connected, because I've never heard of sheriff's homicide detectives taking the Fifth Amendment about an investigation they're conducting. It's just crazy. So that happened because the coroner did an inquest. If you didn't have a separate coroner and sheriff, that wouldn't have happened.
It wouldn't have been an inquest. Yeah. Exactly. I know years ago they were housed together in the same building, and apparently, the separation.
They work very closely together. I used to be a DA. People always say, "Oh, the DA's office is in the pocket of the police." Well, that's kind of true. I mean, the DA's office works with the police, and they trust the police. They have to, and the coroner's the same way. They have to work together. They're very close. So it's not perfect, but again, that's what checks and balances are. That's why you got a guy like me throwing a wrench in the works, because, I put a report up on the website and point out the coroner was just taking the sheriff's word for it to not put autopsies out public. That violated the law. And the Civilian Oversight Commission, with me sitting there, called him on the carpet. I don't say that I was the big mover and shaker of that, but those checks and balances cause all this process to work. You need all the little pieces in order to move things forward. It's messy, but it's effective.
I think so. I think that the proof is in the pudding that right now there is this controversy that, the press is working their part and their angle, and that, us as activists will work ours to, what we do is we want to get people engaged. We don't want to determine who you vote for. Right. We want you to be aware of the situation. So talking about giving people advice and things like that, we're not in that position in terms of talking about who would be a better person in that seat. That's for the voter to determine. But what we want to do is make sure that they have information available to them to make a good choice, because these positions are so influential. I think that's one of the things that we worry about, that the general public out there is not aware of how much influence they can have if they just become voters.
Many of the community, people have to vote. I don't care how people vote. What I care about is that they show up and vote, and that they inform themselves. I showed you my website for a reason. Until John Oliver went on and actually put one of my reports up on his comedy show, I wasn't sure anybody was reading the reports. So if you all who are listening will read those reports and go vote, you'll be doing me a great service no matter how you vote. I swear to God, that's the truth.
And we will have that opportunity in a few short weeks. I think everybody should have already gotten their official sample ballot, because if you if you haven't, it'll be coming out soon, May 9th. You'll be getting your opportunity with your vote by mail ballots that you'll receive. And really, I think that's what we're after. We are aware. We try to facilitate candidate forums for city council for all of these. Our county league, gets involved in sheriff and judges positions and things like that to give people an opportunity to look at all the candidates. And I know that CBS had a forum that they had 6 of the 9 candidates for sheriff. And I think I'll try to find that before we all go away and maybe put that link there, because the whole idea is that having them answer questions before you actually vote on it and getting as much information as possible is one of the things. So I would recommend that. Definitely go to IG Huntsman's website, the Office of, is it the Inspector General?
Yeah, for the website, it's just OIG, Office of Inspector General is what it stands for, but oig.lacounty.gov. But if you just don't want to remember that because it's weird, if you type in Inspector General Los Angeles County, the internet will bring it to you.
And you can get some information about what's available and what's happening in the department, and then compare that to available resources that are out there. I mean, that's the best advice that we can give to any
Get that
voter.
information and then be informed. And one of the weird things, this particular, we're talking about the sheriff's department, and they have a race. There's like 6 or 7 people running. So if you were unhappy with the way the sheriff's department is going and you wanted to have a change, what would you do as a voter? I mean, you've got to think about who do I vote for? And as you say, listening to the candidates, I think, is a good idea. I always caution people from trusting politicians. I think that's a mistake. We all know why. As Americans, we all have beaten into us as children. But I will say, the current sheriff told us something about what he'd do if he was elected. He said that he would kick ICE out of the jails and he would take everybody who was in jail who was not a citizen and take them out to the parking lot and turn them over to ICE, which is crazy. And as soon as he got elected, his own folks said, we can't do that. That's not safe. And eventually they got ICE out of the jails. But my point in that is, if you listened carefully to what he said, you'd know something about who he is before he got elected. And we've got 6 or 7 other people. If you want to know who they are, listen to what they say. I'm not telling you that they're truthful or people will really do what they say, because sometimes they don't. But I do think you can get, if you listen carefully, you can get a sense of the general viewpoint they have about something. And in our current race, most and maybe all of the candidates have said that they would comply with oversight laws. They've noticed the same issues we've noticed. And so from Max Huntsman's point of view, that if there was compliance with oversight laws, we'd be doing a lot better, no matter who was the sheriff. I wouldn't mind if our current sheriff just started to comply with the laws, even though I don't really know anything about any of the individual candidates. I mean, I know something, but I know very little because they haven't been sheriff. So always as a voter, that's a hard thing. And having done prosecutions for corruption, I can tell you, in the places where I prosecuted public officials and they were thrown out of office, the people who came back after them weren't always wonderful. Sometimes the person who comes in and says, I'm a reformer, I'm going to fix everything, they're selling you a bill of goods too, because they want your vote. And that's just politics. And I wish there was a way around that. I think there is. I think we could create another party called the Anti-Corruption Party and not have it be Democrat, Republican, or anything else. And if 51% of the voters joined me in it, I don't think we'd have corruption anymore. It wouldn't solve other problems, but that's not the world we live in. Everybody wants their party. They want their views to be portrayed. And so they'll put up with a lot of shenanigans from their elected leaders in order to get their way. And so we got to work through the mess. So yeah. Thanks for tuning in.
That's why we like being nonpartisan, because it doesn't matter who's in office. We like to hold their feet to the fire regardless, because it's about the issues and the job that they do, and not what party they're from or any of that.
It's a good approach.
Absolutely. And that we like to hang on to that nonpartisanship to make sure we get the ultimate in good governance. That all the public deserves, So we want to thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to our advocacy phase now, and really appreciate your having taken the time and all of the work that you and your organization do just to keep things accountable and transparent, because the probation department and the sheriff's department really impact some of the most vulnerable communities that we have. And, you know, their job is supposed to be to protect the public. And they should really also take on protecting the public from them and the power that they have and the power that they wield. And they don't do that all the time. And, you know, God bless those who actually do the job the way it's supposed to be done, because it's such an honorable task to take on. It's not an easy job.
It's a hard
job. And my hat's off to them who do it well and who are fighting the good fight. And so we want to thank them for their service too. And
Absolutely.
Hopefully they will find a way to be able to work from the inside to clean things up.
Oh, yes, we wouldn't be able to do our job without the cooperation of folks on the inside. That's why what the sheriff's been doing lately, attacking the press and whistleblowers, is so disturbing, because I learn things because people inside the sheriff's department tell me, and what you say is true. It's a hard job, and the people who do it are trying hard, and they need our support. It may not seem like support when all you do is criticize, but it's support. In government, that's the best help you can give people, is to help put them on the right path. So thank you so much for inviting me and giving me a chance to talk a little bit with you. I appreciate it.
Please come back.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Chris, would you like to come on now, please?
Yes, thank you. Great conversation, stimulating. So our guest today, LA County Inspector General Max Huntsman, has shared with us how critical oversight of policing bodies and practices is in making transparency and accountability to local government and the public a reality. The League of Women Voters has a role in this by observing and informing the public and local and state government of how transparent and accountable local police departments and sheriff stations are in following the law. For example, historic new laws on the use of force now mandate police to use deadly force only when necessary to save human life. The law also now requires officers to use de-escalation techniques whenever feasible before resorting to lethal force. However, these legal requirements are being disregarded and unimplemented in policies of a great majority of California police and sheriff's departments, including the 13 cities of our league, resulting in continued high numbers of deaths, especially of Black and Latino Californians, at the hands of law enforcement. Slide 2. Trained league observers can be eyes and ears of the community, reporting to city councils and to the State Department of Justice, which has enforcement power. We can also report back to communities impacted by excessive and lethal use of force for their comment and action. Another opportunity for league monitoring law enforcement is the State Racial and Identity Profiling Act, or RIPA, which currently is requiring all police department patrol officers in our league cities to complete a survey during 2022 on each person stopped for traffic, pedestrian, or bicycle transgressions. The survey asks the officer to state who they perceive needed to be stopped, why, and what happened as a result. The data will be available to cities next year, showing if there is racial or sexual profiling going on. Observers will then have the data to urge cities allowing such profiling to obey the law and to report successes or failure to the State Department of Justice. The League has training to offer new observers. Our Policing Practices Subcommittee would love to have observers attend online or in person the Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission and report back on department accountability over policies on deputy gangs, for example. We'd like to know how local police departments are adhering to the new use of lethal force and de-escalation requirements. Local eyes and ears can go a long way in letting government know that they are being watched for accountability and transparency. So join us. Help keep democracy alive and thriving at the local level. You can contact us at the numbers listed on the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for that. I urge you all to get actively involved, because we know that after an election, once we vote, that's not all there is. We have to keep up our activism. We have to keep up our oversight and trying to make sure that our residents are aware of what's going on, get the voice out there heard, so that people get engaged and recognize how much control they actually have over their elected officials. So thank you very much for that, Chris. One of the things I wanted to bring up before our next couple of slides is that we are going to have our annual meeting coming up in June, on June 18th, and I would urge all of our members to please sign up for that. We have our board elections and other business to take care of. So our business meeting, again, June 18th, it's on our website. Please go there and sign up for it as soon as possible. I wanted to bring up the next slide, please. One of the things that we're want to urge you to do is that we have a Pasadena City College Board of Trustees election coming up for Area 5. And today there is a candidate forum, so that if you have this particular district, and even if you are in another district of the Pasadena City College Board of Trustees, you probably want to know about this 5th district. So please be sure that you participate and attend and get an opportunity to directly ask a question of those candidates. So if we are doing the facilitating, that means we will moderate. We will make sure we gather the questions from the audience and present them to the candidates in a fair manner. So please go ahead and attend for that. And the next slide, please. We do hope that you've enjoyed the program. So remember that the video of this presentation will be available on our LWVPA YouTube channel, courtesy of Pasadena Media. Now, we keep saying LWVPA, make sure you always put in that hyphen or you'll end up in Pennsylvania instead of Pasadena. And thank you to our Events and Communications Committee for working behind the scenes to host the event. Thank you to Chris Ockershauser, I can't pronounce it, sorry, for that informative introduction of our speaker and for our Take Action session. And finally, to our Zoom hosts, Catherine, Valerie, and Veronica, thank you very much. To our wonderful attendees. And everybody get out there and celebrate Asian and Pacific Islander Month, taking note of all the accomplishments and contributions of the community. So thank you very much. Get out there, take action, look at your sample ballot, be ready to do your vote by mail, but remember one thing, don't rush to judgment. Please research the candidates and any ballot measures there. I believe Monrovia has a ballot measure. And please take a look at it. There's a lot of information that always goes out. Take advantage of it before you cast your vote. You will have at least 3 weeks to fill out your ballot and submit it in any number of ways. So please do that. And thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.